At Lord Lucien Vale's funeral, the entire kingdom watched his widow stand beside the coffin without crying. The nobles whispered about it afterward. Cold woman, ungrateful wife. Poor Lucien loved her more than life. But none of them saw the way her hands trembled beneath the black sleeves of her dress. None of them understood why she kept staring at the coffin as though she expected it to open, or why, when the ceremony finally ended and the cathedral emptied, and she was left alone beside the candles and flowers and silence, she inhaled like a drowning person reaching air. For the first time in 8 years, Arabella Vale could breathe without permission, and that terrified her more than grief. Welcome to Moon Noir. If you have ever loved someone who slowly became the thing that hurt you, this story is for you. If this is your first time here, subscribe and like. You found the right place. Let us begin. Before he became the man she survived, Lucien Vale was the man every woman in the kingdom dreamed about. Brilliant, beautiful, dangerous, in the specific way powerful men become dangerous when they know exactly how much power they possess. He was the youngest war commander in royal history. The newspapers called him the Iron Prince long before he officially inherited anything. Men respected him, women desired him. The kingdom trusted him with its future before he was even 30. But what the newspapers did not write about, what the kingdom did not see, in the formal portraits and the military dispatches and the political correspondence, was the specific private weight of being Lucien Vale. He had been carrying authority since he was 19. His father died during a border skirmish when Lucien was barely finished with his military training, and the title passed to him before he had decided what kind of man he wanted to be, before he had been given the specific luxury of figuring that out. So he became what was required: decisive, controlled, impenetrable. He learned to read rooms before entering them, learned to assess people before they finished their first sentence, learned to manage his own expressions so completely that even people who had known him for years could not reliably tell what he was thinking. This was useful. It was also profoundly lonely. The specifics loneliness of a man who has been performing competence for so long that he has forgotten what it feels like to simply be present in a room without managing what the room thinks of him. He did not know he was lonely. He was too busy to know. Then he met Arabella Vale, and for the first time in years, Lucien looked uncertain around someone. She was not noble enough for him, not politically useful, not ambitious, not particularly interested in court games. She painted. That was what she loved. Not status, not power, not influence, paint. Lucien first saw her at a winter exhibition, where she stood in this corner beside one of her landscapes looking vaguely uncomfortable, while rich people pretended to understand art. He crossed the room toward her without introducing himself first. "You painted this?" Arabella looked up carefully. Yes. He studied the painting again. It was a storm coastline beneath moonlight, lonely, violent, beautiful. It looked like grief trying to stay elegant. Lucien stared at it for a long time. He had spent years surrounded by things that were trying to impress someone. Architecture built to communicate power, clothing designed to signal status, conversations engineered to establish advantage. This painting was not trying to do any of those things. It was simply honest. He looked back at her. Everyone else in this room is lying to impress each other. Yours is the only honest thing here. Arabella looked at him for a moment. Then she said, with the specific directness of someone who does not spend time on pleasantries, "You are not what I expected." He was surprised to find himself smiling. That was the beginning. And he loved her beautifully at first. Flowers arrived every morning, letters every night. He learned her favorite tea after hearing her mention it once. He listened when she spoke as though every word mattered. Not with the managed attention of a man performing interest, but with the full genuine attention of someone who has found something they want to understand completely. Arabella had spent most of her life feeling quietly invisible, not dramatically, not the theatrical invisibility of someone nobody liked. Simply the specific gentle invisibility of a woman who was kind and thoughtful and present, and somehow not quite the person anyone's attention landed on first. Lucien made invisibility impossible. When he looked at her completely. The way he assessed rooms and people, turned entirely in her direction. Without the management, without the filter. Simply looking, she felt it the first time and did not know what to do with it. The second time she understood. He was seeing her, not performing seeing, actually seeing. When he asked her to marry him 6 months later beneath the silver lanterns of the royal gardens, she said yes before he finished the question. The kingdom celebrated the wedding for weeks. People called it the greatest love story in modern history. They were wrong. The tragedy of a story is rarely visible at the beginning. The first year of marriage was happy enough to confuse her later. That was part of what made surviving him difficult. He had not always been cruel. Lucien loved intensely, protectively, possessively in ways that initially felt romantic. He wanted to know where she was because he worried. He disliked certain people around her because he wanted to protect her. He became irritated when she spent long hours painting alone because he missed her. At first it sounded like love, because love and control often speak with the same voice in the beginning. Arabella did not notice the changes immediately. Not when he quietly discouraged her from seeing a particular friend, because the woman was, as he put it, not quite the kind of company appropriate for someone in Arabella's new position. Arabella had not especially liked the friend anyway. She let it go. Not when he started commenting on which dresses she wore to public events. He had better instincts for court politics than she did. He understood what certain colors communicated to certain people. She trusted his judgment, not even when he moved her painting room farther into the West Wing, because the smell of oils gave him headaches. The West Wing had better light, he pointed out. And he was right. The light was genuinely better. None of it seemed large enough individually. Each concession was reasonable. Each adjustment made sense in isolation. That was how it happened. Not all at once, gradually, patiently. Like winter arriving 1 degree at a time. The room does not feel cold. And then one morning, you realize you have not been warm in months, and you cannot remember exactly when that changed. In the second year, the silences began. Lucien never shouted then. That came later. In the beginning, disappointment was enough. Arabella discovered quickly that Lucien's silence could make a room feel colder than anger ever could. If she upset him, he withdrew, emotionally first, then physically. He stopped touching her. Stopped kissing her goodbye in the mornings. Stopped looking at her directly during meals. The first time it lasted 3 days. Arabella spent those 3 days trying to identify what she had done. Replaying conversations. Examining decisions. Searching for the moment where she had made the wrong choice and trying to understand how to avoid making it again. When he came back, when the warmth returned, the relief was so enormous that she cried and could not entirely explain why. He held her and did not ask about the tears. And because she loved him, because his warmth mattered so much to her, she learned to fear the coldness. That was the beginning of the damage. Not fear of violence, fear of losing love. There is a specific kind of damage that comes from loving someone whose warmth is conditional. The damage is not in the cold moments. The damage is in the anticipation of them. The constant monitoring, the specific exhausting work of trying to prevent a withdrawal you cannot entirely predict. Arabella did not know this was happening to her. She simply knew that she was tired in a way that sleep did not fix. By the 3rd year of marriage, Arabella had become quieter. Not because Lucien ordered silence, because silence became safer. She learned which opinions exhausted him, which topics irritated him. Which tones of voice made his expression change almost imperceptibly in ways she had learned to read before anyone else in the room noticed. She learned the geography of his moods, the way you learn the geography of a space you live in. Which floorboards creak, which doors stick, where the cold drafts come from. Not because anyone told her, because survival required it. So she adjusted herself around him the way rivers adjust around stone, quietly. Continuously, without deciding to. The palace noticed, the servants noticed first. Servants always do. They are the people who see the private face of a household that the public world never witnesses. They noticed that Lady Vale apologized constantly now, for speaking too long at dinner when a guest asked her a question, for laughing at something a footman said in the corridor, for interrupting accidentally when she did not realize Lucien was still speaking, for asking the housekeeper to repeat something she had not heard the first time. Once, during a formal dinner with 6 guests, she dropped a spoon. The sound against the plate was tiny, barely audible above the general conversation of the table. But Arabella immediately whispered sorry under her breath before anyone reacted, before a single face had turned toward her, before the sound had fully finished. The apology was faster than the response could have been, which meant it had not been prompted by anyone's reaction. It had been prompted by her own anticipation of one. Lucien looked at her across the table. Something unreadable crossed his face. Not guilt, recognition, because some part of him understood what he was doing. And still he continued. That was the terrible thing about Lucien. He was not unaware. He simply kept choosing himself over what the awareness demanded. He kept choosing the version of the relationship that gave him what he needed, without examining what it was costing her, because examining it would have required him to change, and changing was more frightening than the awareness. So, he looked at his wife, apologizing reflexively for a dropped spoon, and he filed it somewhere he did not have to look at directly, and he picked up his own fork and continued the dinner. Meanwhile, the kingdom adored them. Lucien worshipped her publicly. Jewels delivered to her dressing room on ordinary Tuesday mornings, for no occasion. Poems written in his careful angular handwriting and left on her pillow. Dances at royal galas, where he looked at her across the floor, the way he had looked at her painting at the winter exhibition, like the most honest thing in the room. People envied her life because they saw the gestures, not the aftermath, not the nights she cried quietly beside him, while he slept untouched on the opposite side of the bed, after an argument she could barely remember starting. The arguments were never about large things, they were always about small things. A dinner she had agreed to attend without asking him first. A letter she had written to a sister without mentioning it. Small things that accumulated, in his accounting, into evidence of something larger. Evidence that she was not orienting herself entirely around him. Not the way she rehearsed sentences before speaking to him now. Turning them over in her mind, testing them against her internal map of his moods, removing anything that might land wrong before she said it aloud. Not the way her body tensed whenever doors opened suddenly, whenever footsteps approached in a corridor, whenever a room she was in acquired a new presence before she had identified whose presence it was. Not the way she had stopped painting publicly, had moved her work entirely into the West Wing studio, had begun only painting at night, had begun treating her own creative work like something that needed to be hidden. The worst prisons are the ones nobody believes exist, especially the ones built from love, especially the ones that have flowers delivered on Tuesday mornings and poems on pillows and dances at royal galas. Arabella had been painting secretly for 3 years by the time Lucien found the studio. In the beginning, before the West Wing, before the concealment, painting had simply been what she did. It was not a statement. It was not a rebellion. It was as natural to her as breathing, as ordinary and necessary and continuous. She had been painting since she was 7 years old. Her mother had given her a set of small watercolor paints for her birthday, and she had never really stopped. The subjects changed. The scale changed. The skill grew into something that other people noticed and admired, and eventually paid to see at exhibitions. But the essential thing had always been the same. When she painted, she was entirely herself. Not the version of herself she had been editing and adjusting and monitoring. Not the version that anticipated and managed and absorbed. Simply herself. Lucien had not asked her to stop painting publicly. He had simply made it clear, in the gradual, indirect way, that he communicated most things. That he found her professional engagement with the art world slightly embarrassing. She was a Vale now, the wife of the Iron Prince. Public exhibitions felt to him like a performance of a previous version of her that she no longer needed to be. She had not argued. She had simply stopped. But stopping painting entirely was not something her body would allow, so she moved it. Into the night. Into the west wing, where the light was better and where Lucien did not often go. Into the specific private hours, between his sleeping and her sleeping, when she could be at the canvas without managing anything. In the first year of the secret painting, the work was mostly landscapes, coastlines, gardens, the specific quality of light at different hours of the day. Then something shifted. She did not notice it shifting while it was happening. She only noticed it when she stepped back from a canvas one night and looked at what she had made and understood that she had been painting something she had not consciously decided to paint. A woman standing at the center of an enormous empty room, looking at a door. The door was closed. The woman was not trying to open it. She was simply standing there, waiting. Arabella looked at the painting for a long time. Then she covered it with a cloth and went to bed. But the next night she was back in the studio, and the night after that, and slowly, over the following months, the canvases filled with women. Not landscapes, women. Women trapped beneath water with their eyes open. Women standing in hallways that stretched too long in both directions. Women without mouths. Women looking over their shoulders at something the painting did not show. Women curled into themselves in enormous cold rooms. Women at windows looking at things the viewer could not see. She did not entirely understand what she was painting. She understood it completely. One evening, Lucien returned unexpectedly early from a council meeting that had ended sooner than scheduled. Arabella was in the West studio. He entered without warning and stopped. There were paintings everywhere. Not landscapes anymore. Women, dozens of them on every wall, propped against surfaces, stacked against each other at the edges of the room. Lucien stared at them. He went from one to the next slowly, not rushing, taking time with each one. He had not commissioned these paintings. He had not posed for them. He was not in a single one. And yet every painting in that room was about him. Then he looked at her. Arabella stood frozen beside the easel, her brush still in her hand, paint on her forearms from the work she had been doing before she heard his footsteps. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Lucien asked quietly, "Is this how you see me?" Arabella should have lied. She had gotten very good at managing what she said, at testing sentences before speaking them, at removing anything that might land wrong. Instead she said nothing, and silence answered him more honestly than words ever could. Lucien looked around the studio again. For the first time since their marriage began, he saw evidence of what living beside him had done to her. Not because she accused him, because she painted him without painting him. Woman in every canvas was a record of something, not named, not labeled, but present. The specific visual testimony of someone who could not say the thing out loud, and had been saying it onto canvas instead. That night he did not sleep in their bedroom. Arabella sat awake alone until sunrise. And somewhere, deep inside herself, she understood something terrifying. She no longer knew whether she loved her husband, or feared losing the version of him from the beginning. She was not sure those were different things anymore. The sentence happened during rain. Arabella would remember that forever. The storm outside, the firelight, the sound of thunder behind his voice, as though the weather understood what was happening in the room, and had decided to provide accompaniment. Lucien had discovered she had been in correspondence with the gallery owner who had represented her work before the marriage. Nothing arranged yet, nothing confirmed, simply a conversation, the opening of a possibility. A small private exhibition, something that belonged only to her, and for reasons even he did not fully understand. The discovery enraged him, perhaps because independent happiness felt like abandonment to people who confuse love with possession. Perhaps because the exhibition represented a version of her that existed outside his definition of her. Perhaps because he had spent years slowly making himself the center of her world, and the thought of anything existing in her life that did not orbit him was intolerable in a way he could not have explained if asked to. He did not examine the rage, he simply felt it and expressed it. The argument escalated slowly, the way all their arguments escalated. Not with raised voices immediately. With the specific controlled anger of a man who had been managing his expressions for years and was losing the grip on that management. Lucien accused her of shutting him out, of making decisions without him, of treating the marriage as something she participated in selectively rather than completely. Arabella, who had been absorbing things quietly for 3 years and had spent the weeks since the studio discovery sitting with the knowledge of what the paintings meant, said something she had not planned to say. She told him he had been controlling everything she loved since the 2nd year of their marriage. She said it quietly, not with the heat of performed anger, simply as a fact. The silence after it was different from the silence she had learned to manage. Then suddenly he said it. "You would be nothing without me." The words left his mouth before he had decided to say them. Lucien regretted it the moment they landed. He could see it landing, could see the specific way Arabella's face changed when she received it. Not dramatically, worse, quietly, like something inside her sat down and stopped fighting. She looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded once, not in agreement. In the specific way of someone receiving information they had been resisting for years and have finally run out of energy to resist. As though some part of her had always been afraid this was how he saw her and had just been given confirmation. Lucien crossed the room immediately. "Arabella." But she stepped backward before he reached her, and Lucien froze, because she looked afraid of him, not angry, afraid. The specific involuntary fear of a body that has learned something before the mind has finished deciding what to do with it. She had not decided to step back. Her body had simply done it. That expression haunted him afterward, more than anything else from that night. Not what he had said, not what she had said, the step backward. Because it revealed something he had been refusing to see. Somewhere along the way, the woman who once ran toward him had learned to move away instead. After the argument, something shifted inside Arabella, not dramatically. She did not pack a bag, or make a declaration, or demand a reckoning. She did not confront him with the full accumulated weight of 3 years of absorbing things quietly. She simply stopped. Stopped trying to repair every silence before it became something. Stopped apologizing first. Stopped asking permission for things that did not require permission. Stopped monitoring his expression before completing her own sentences. At first, Lucien interpreted it as temporary anger, the specific withdrawal of a woman who had said too much and was embarrassed and would come back around once the embarrassment faded. Then weeks passed, and she remained distant in a way that felt peaceful rather than hostile. She was not cold toward him. She was simply no longer oriented toward him. That frightened him more than anger would have. Because anger he could manage. Anger required a response, and he was good at responses. He could apologize, strategically, sufficiently, in a way that restored the equilibrium without requiring him to examine what had created the disruption. But this was not anger. This was someone quietly removing their emotional center of gravity from his vicinity. And he had no strategy for that. She began painting openly again, not in secret, not at night in the West Wing when he was asleep. In the mornings, in the afternoon light, with the studio door open, she began reading in the palace gardens in the afternoon, alone, with a book she had chosen herself from the library, without asking if he had any preference. She began walking through the city without an escort on Tuesday mornings. She had discovered a market she liked. A bookseller with an extraordinary collection of natural history illustrations. A florist whose arrangements were the specific combination of wild and deliberate that she found beautiful. Small things, ordinary things. Things that any person living their own life would do without thinking. But Lucien noticed all of them. Because for years, Arabella's emotional gravity had orbited entirely around him. She had been so thoroughly oriented toward his moods and his needs and his preferences that her independent movements had become almost invisible. So when pieces of her began returning elsewhere, Each piece was visible against the background of everything that had been absent. One afternoon, he found himself walking through the market district, on a route he did not usually take, for a reason he could not remember deciding on. And he saw her. She was at the florist's stall. The elderly man who kept the most extraordinary wild arrangements in the market. She was laughing at something he had said. Not the careful, measured laugh of someone monitoring whether laughter was appropriate in the current social context. Not performing, not careful, simply laughing. The specific sound of someone who has forgotten, for a moment, that they have learned to check first. Lucien stood across the street. He had a clear view. She had not seen him. And he stood there and understood with sudden devastating clarity that he had not heard that sound in years. Not because she had stopped being capable of joy. Because joy had stopped feeling safe around him. Somewhere in the years of conditional warmth and emotional withdrawal and managed disappointment, he had created conditions in which his wife could not simply laugh at something a florist said. He had done that, not with cruelty in its most obvious forms, with the specific accumulated of weight love that had been transformed gradually into something that required her to monitor herself constantly in its presence. That realization cracked something open inside him. Not enough, not yet, but something. For the first time, Lucien became afraid, not of losing control, of losing her. Lucien discovered them accidentally. He had gone to the West Studio, looking for a specific book he thought he had left there during one of the evenings he had taken to sitting in that room since the studio discovery. He had found himself returning to the room repeatedly, without entirely understanding why. Perhaps because it was the place where he had finally seen something he could not unsee. The book was not there, but in moving a stack of canvases to look for it, he found the wooden box. Plain, dark wood, slightly worn at the corners from being handled, hidden beneath the canvases in a way that was not elaborate, but was deliberate. Not something left there by accident. He should not have opened it. He knew that immediately. He opened it anyway. Inside were dozens of letters, folded, some of them, others simply placed in the box flat, as though they had been written and put away immediately, without the formality of folding. All of them addressed to him. None of them sent. He picked up the first one. The earliest letters were hopeful. I miss you even when you are beside me. I do not know how to explain that. You are right there, and I miss you. The version of you from before. The one who looked at my painting at the exhibition and said it was the only honest thing in the room. I keep looking for him. I think he is still somewhere in there. He put that one down, picked up another. I wish you would speak to me gently again. Not always. I know you are tired. I know the counsel is difficult. I know there are pressures I do not fully understand. I am not asking for perfection. I am asking for the way you used to say my name. Just occasionally. The way you said it at the beginning. He sat down on the floor. He kept reading. I do not know how to reach you lately. I have been trying different approaches, being quieter, being more present, being less present, asking questions, not asking questions. I cannot find the version of myself that you are comfortable with, and I am running out of versions to try. Then the letters changed. I feel myself disappearing, not all at once, in small amounts. I used to have opinions about things, strong ones. I noticed them today because I tried to form one at dinner, and it took me a long time to find it, as though it had moved somewhere less accessible. You look at me like I am another responsibility. I am not sure when that changed. I am not sure if it changed, or if I simply stopped being able to ignore it. I keep trying to become smaller so loving me feels easier for you. I realize this today. I have been doing it consciously, choosing the smaller option, the quieter version, the less visible position. Because smaller things are easier to accommodate. Smaller things cause less friction. I have been making myself smaller, and I did not decide to, and now I am not sure how to stop. Lucien sat on the studio floor reading them until dawn. He read all of them, the hopeful early ones, the confused middle ones, the ones that documented specific things she had noticed about herself. The ones that read like someone keeping careful clinical records of their own disappearance. Near the bottom of the box was the final letter. It had never been folded, never sealed. It had simply been placed in the box and not returned to. It simply read, "I think surviving you may require leaving you." Lucien stared at the sentence for a very long time. The lamp on the studio table had burned low. The window was beginning to show the specific grey of very early morning. He had been on this floor for hours and he had not noticed the time passing because the letters had required all of him. Then he cried for the first time since childhood. Not because she might leave. Not even because he had read something he was not supposed to read. Because he finally understood the scale of what he had done. He had taken the softest thing ever given to him. The most open and genuine and honest person he had ever encountered. The woman who made invisibility impossible when she said, "You are not what I expected," and smiled at him with the specific smile of someone who has not yet learned to manage their expressions around him. And he had taught it fear, not with violence, not with cruelty in its most visible forms, with the specific slow accumulated damage of love that had been distorted by control, until the person on the receiving end of it could no longer laugh at a florist's joke without checking first. He had done that. He sat with the full weight of that, until the morning arrived completely. Arabella left 3 weeks later. No screaming, sits, no scandal, no public humiliation. Lucien came home from the council chambers at his usual hour, and found the palace different, before he understood what was different about it. A quality of silence that was not the ordinary silence of a large house in the afternoon. Something absent from it. Her clothes were gone, her brushes missing. The West studio empty of everything she had brought to it. Only one thing remained. A painting. It stood alone near the window on the small wooden easel she had used since before the marriage. The easel she had brought with her. On the day she arrived, because it had been her mother's and she could not leave it behind. The easel was still there. The painting on it was new. Lucien approached it slowly. It was him. Not literally. Not a portrait. Not his face or his coat or any recognizable feature. An enormous dark ocean during winter. Violent waves beneath a starless sky. Black water in every direction and near the horizon. Very small, very distant. One warm lantern glowing against the darkness. At the bottom corner, in her tiny careful handwriting, she had written, "You were not always the storm." Lucien stood in front of the painting for a long time. Then he sank to the floor. He did not know how long he sat there. He was still there when the lamp needed refilling, and the light changed around him. And the palace staff moved carefully around the corridor outside the studio, and nobody knocked because nobody could identify what to say. He looked at the painting until he understood it completely. The storm was him, not the man he had been at the beginning. The man he had become. The man who had read her letters on this floor 3 weeks ago and understood what he had built. The lantern was him too. The man at the winter exhibition who had looked at her painting and said it's the only honest thing, and who had listened to her with the full quality of attention, and who had learned her favorite tea, and who had looked at her the way nobody had looked at her before. Both versions true. She was not saying he was only the storm, she was saying he had not always been, which was, in its way, the most devastating thing she could have said. Because it meant there had been something worth mourning, and for the first time in years, the great Lord Lucien Vale understood helplessness. Because love cannot be demanded back once fear has replaced safety. Lucien spent the following year dismantling himself. Not publicly, privately, painfully, without an audience, because the work of dismantling yourself does not benefit from an audience. An audience changes what you are doing, turns it into performance. And performance was the thing he was trying to stop. He began with the smallest things. He stopped commanding rooms the way he once had. The specific managed authority of a man who enters a space and immediately establishes the hierarchy of it. He began instead entering rooms as though he was simply arriving somewhere rather than taking possession of it. It felt profoundly uncomfortable. He did it anyway. He stopped using silence as punishment. This was harder than the rooms. The silence had become so ometsnek that he did not always notice he was doing it, until he had been doing it for several hours, and the temperature of a conversation had dropped significantly. He began catching it earlier, then earlier than that, then sometimes before it started. He stopped confusing control with devotion. This one took the longest, because it required him to look at the specific architecture of what he had believed love was. The idea that keeping someone sinkless meant keeping track of them. That protection meant management. That caring about someone meant having opinions about the decisions they made. He began seeing a royal physician who specialized in what the physician carefully called the management of difficult inherited behavioral patterns. Among the court, this would have been understood as a significant admission of weakness. Lucien went anyway. Twice a week, without telling anyone. What he learned was not comfortable. That his possessiveness had never been about Arabella. It had been about terror. The specific terror of a 19-year-old boy who had watched the only person who looked at him with unconditional warmth die in a border skirmish, and had spent the subsequent years creating structures of control to ensure that nothing he loved could simply leave him. That his control had never been about her choices. It had been about his wounds. The wounds that predated her by years, and that he had never done anything about, because doing something about them would have required admitting they existed. That he treated love like something that could disappear unless constantly restrained. Which meant the thing he had been calling love was actually fear wearing love's clothing. Understanding it did not excuse it. He knew that. He said that to the physician in their third session, and the physician agreed with the specific quiet certainty of someone who had been waiting to confirm it. Understanding does not undo, but it is where undoing begins. He wrote that in the margin of one of the session notes. He kept the note. Meanwhile, Arabella had built a new life in a coastal town 3 days' journey from the capital. She had rented a small house with large windows facing the sea. She had set up her studio in the main room where the light was best. She had begun introducing herself by her original name, Arabella Marin, not Vale, Marin. She painted every day, not secretly, not at night. In the mornings and the afternoons and sometimes in the evenings, when the coastal light did things to the water that she wanted to record. The paintings were different now. Not women in empty hallways. Not women looking over their shoulders. Coastlines, open water, the sky at different hours. The specific quality of light on the sea just before rain. She slept peacefully for the first time in years. The specific deep sleep of someone who no longer woke at 3 a.m, rutting a search through the day's interactions for the thing she had done wrong. She made a friend, an elderly woman who kept a bookshop 3 streets from her house, and who had opinions about everything and was interested in Arabella's opinions in return, and did not require her to make herself smaller to accommodate the space the friendship occupied. She laughed easily, not checking first, but healing was not clean. Some nights she still missed him so violently she could barely breathe. Not the man he had become, the man from the beginning. The man at the winter exhibition who had said the only honest thing, who had learned her favorite tea, who had looked at her the way nobody had looked at her before or since. She missed that man the way you miss a place that no longer exists, because he had existed. That was not a thing she could simply decide to stop being true. Because surviving someone does not erase loving them. That was the tragedy. Lucien had not been a monster every moment. He had been the love of her life. And also the thing she survived. Both things were true. Both things would always be true. And she was learning, slowly, that holding both at once was not a contradiction. It was simply the honest shape of the thing. 2 years later, war reached the coast. It arrived without much warning. The way territorial conflicts always arrive, after years of building slowly. After the tension has been present so long, it becomes simply the texture of the air. After the people living near the border have stopped paying attention, because nothing has happened yet, and nothing happening yet begins to feel like nothing will. Arabella's town became dangerous overnight. She's to the sound of horses and the specific quality of voices that communicate urgency without identifying its source. And she understood, before she looked out the window, that something had changed significantly. She was at her window when she saw the royal guard crest on the lead horse. And then she saw him. Lucien arrived before dawn with royal guards and a small military contingent, and the specific controlled urgency of a man who had received information and acted on it immediately without spending time on anything except the acting. When Arabella opened the door and saw him standing there beneath the snowfall, something inside her nearly collapsed from memory alone. His coat was dark and travel-worn. His hair was slightly longer than court convention required. He had clearly ridden through the night. But he looked different, softer somehow, tired in human ways, rather than the specific performed tiredness of a man who wanted people to understand how much he was carrying. Simply tired. The tiredness of someone who had been doing difficult things for a long time, and was not particularly interested in managing what that looked like. Not the terrifying man who once filled every room completely. Simply a man standing in the snow outside her door, having ridden through the night, to make sure she was safe. Lucien Vale looked at her for a long moment. He did not step toward her. He did not attempt to take up more of the doorway than the doorway offered him. He simply stood there with the specific posture of someone who has arrived somewhere and is waiting to understand what is wanted of them rather than deciding for themselves. Then he said the words she had needed years earlier. "You do not owe me forgiveness to deserve safety." Arabella stared at him. She had prepared herself for many possible versions of this moment. She had imagined it occasionally, in the coastal town, not with any intention. Simply the mind going where it went sometimes in the evenings. She had imagined him asking for forgiveness, explaining himself, making arguments, presenting evidence of change. She had not imagined him beginning by releasing her from any obligation before she had said a single word. "You do not owe me forgiveness to deserve safety." And for the first time in nearly a decade, she believed him. Not because the words were extraordinary, because the man who said them was standing in the snow outside her door. Not stepping forward, simply waiting, until she indicated whether stepping forward was wanted. That was not the man she had survived. That was someone who had been doing the work. Lucien escorted the coastal town safely inland during the attacks over the following 3 days. He moved between the affected areas with the military efficiency of a man who had been doing this work since he was 19. Organized, decisive, effective. And during the final assault on the northern pass, covering the evacuation of civilians trapped beneath collapsed stone in the aftermath of the initial engagement, he died. Not dramatically. The accounts that reached Arabella later were specific. He had been moving people out of an unstable structure. The structure had shifted. He had pushed the last 3 people out before it came down. He had died doing something that had nothing to do with power or control or management. He had died making a choice. The kingdom mourned him as a hero. The newspapers called him the Iron Prince one last time. Arabella mourned him as something more complicated, which brings us back to the funeral. The cathedral emptied slowly. The nobles and the military commanders and the council members and the various political figures who had attended because Lucien Vale was the kind of man whose funeral required attendance filed out through the great doors and into the winter morning, and the cathedral returned gradually to silence. Arabella remained beside the coffin alone. The candles burned around her, the flowers, the specific formal arrangement of a state funeral for a man who had been publicly important. She touched the black wood of the coffin carefully, and finally she cried. Not the managed quiet crying of the middle years when she cried, without making sound beside a man who did not notice. Simply crying, in an empty cathedral, alone beside the coffin of the most complicated person she had ever known. Not because she wished to return to the life they had shared. Not because the damage had vanished, or could be retroactively undone, or should be minimized in the light of what he had become at the end. but because somewhere beneath all the fear and grief and ruin, there had once been genuine love. The man at the winter exhibition had been. The letters every night had been real. The way he said her name at the beginning, before he had learned to use it as something other than a name, had been real. That was worth mourning. And because Lucien had spent the final years of his life trying to become someone safer than the man she survived. The physician visits nobody knew about. The slow, difficult private work of a man examining the architecture of his own damage and trying to dismantle it without an audience to perform the dismantling for. She had not known about any of that until after. Until the physician had written to her because Lucien had left instructions for the letter to be sent in the event of his death. He had not written to tell her he had changed. He had simply left a letter that said he was trying, and that he understood if trying was insufficient, and that she deserved the coastal town, and the morning light, and the paintings, and the laughter at the florist's stall, and he was glad she had found those things. She had read the letter 3 times on the journeys to the funeral. She stood there a moment longer beside the coffin, not for him, for the girl who said yes, beneath the silver lanterns of the royal gardens, before she understood what yes would cost her. That girl had been so certain, so entirely ready to be chosen, so relieved to be seen. She deserved to be acknowledged. She deserved to have someone stand beside the coffin of the man who had both chosen her and damaged her, and say, on her behalf, that both things had been true, and both things mattered, and the damage did not erase the love, and the love did not excuse the damage, and she had been right to leave, and she had been right to grieve, and she was allowed to be standing here, in this cathedral, crying for the most complicated reason possible. Arabella whispered softly, I loved you, but I deserve to survive you too. Outside the cathedral, winter snow began falling across the kingdom. Inside, the candles burned down slowly beside a coffin that contained the love of her life, and also the thing she survived. Both things true, both things hers. Arabella Vale turned away from the coffin and walked toward the doors alone. Not broken, not healed completely, but free. She had loved him completely, she had survived him completely, and she was walking out of that cathedral, carrying both things in her chest simultaneously. Not as a contradiction, as the honest shape of the thing. The future belonged to her now, and she intended to live it, on her own terms, in the morning light, with paint on her hands. Take a moment with that, then tell me which moment got you. The first change, the dropped spoon, the paintings. You would be nothing without me. The unsent letters, the storm painting she left behind. You do not owe me forgiveness to deserve safety. The funeral, the final whisper. Tell me which one. I read every single one. Subscribe and turn on notifications. The next story is already waiting. Until then, take care of yourself. And remember, surviving someone you loved is not a betrayal of the love. Sometimes it is the only honest thing left to do. Moon Noir.